This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. Happy to be with you on a very chilly Wednesday, at least where I'm at. Maybe it's a little warmer where you're at. In a moment, going to be talking with, I got to admit, I've been covering politics in North Dakota for, more than 2 decades now. I have never done an interview in a judicial race before. And I don't know, maybe that's because they're not very often races. We'll get into that in a moment. Anyway, our guest, because Chad Oban, as always, is joining me as the co-host on Wednesday. Our guest this week is a man. He is currently a justice on the North Dakota Supreme Court, and he's announced that he's going to run for another 10-year term. That's the justices on the state Supreme Court serve for 10-year terms. He's going to be on the ballot for another one this year. And we're going to talk with him about that. But, of course, before we get in there, my usual spiel. Thank you all for listening. Really appreciate it. The response in the last 6 months, the audience for this podcast has just grown tremendously, which is fantastic. Really appreciate everybody tuning in. Make sure if you're listening, the best way, that if you want to help the show, the best way, and what I think is the most convenient way, subscribe via an app. Spotify, Pocket Cast. There's a ton of podcasting apps out there. If you subscribe that way, when there's new episodes, you get a notification that pops up. That's super awesome. If whatever podcasting platform you're listening on allows you to rate or leave a review for the podcast, if you do that, I'd certainly appreciate it. And of course, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't urge you to subscribe to the Fargo Forum or the Grand Forks Herald or the Jamestown Sun. Hey, you subscribe to one, you get all of them. It's $10 a month. I don't know. We have like a couple of dozen newspapers. I don't think I could sit and name for you all the newspapers that Forum Communications owns. It's quite a few. But if one subscription, you get access to all of them, including my work. Or if you don't like my work so much, hey, they cover like Bison football, UND hockey. They cover lots of stuff. You don't even have to read my stuff. Anyway, so all that done, inforum.com/subscribe. That's probably the easiest URL to go to. But really, if you go to any of the websites and you subscribe, again, that subscription works for all of them. So now, let's go to our guest, North Dakota Supreme Court Justice Crothers. How are you?
I am great. It's cold out, but warm inside, and it's always good to talk to fellow people who are interested in our system of government and the judiciary in particular, even though it took you a few years to come around to us.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, I guess, I want to get in. I mean, you've been in, you've been in on the North Dakota Supreme Court for quite a while, but I guess I want to get into your campaign and why you want another term, because all that stuff's important. But maybe let's just start with that. Why do you think so often these judicial races are unchallenged? And I actually went back, and of course, I should have had my note in front of me. Instead, I buried it under a laptop. But I actually went back, and I went all the way back to 1990, and I looked at every statewide ballot. And this is just for North Dakota Supreme Court races. And some years we have more than one Supreme Court race because, maybe somebody got appointed, and so they have to get. In fact, I think you were appointed originally, and then you had to run to get the rest of your initial term. But of these races, there was only 1, 2, 3, 4 races since 1990 that were competitive races featuring more than one candidate. Why is that?
I think it's a couple reasons. One, most of them are filled. Most of the vacancies are filled by appointment, and that's just by number. We have a 10-year term, and as often as not, somebody retires or unfortunately occasionally dies in office. And there's a vacancy, and we have a judicial nominating committee and the governor that appoint to fill the vacancy. So first off, the seat isn't open immediately. And the person who is appointed to fill a vacancy under the Constitution gets at least 2 years to serve. And that was an amendment that came around in the 90s after 2 recent appointees were they were immediately challenged. One of them was defeated. The other 2 were retained in the election. But the clear message back from the legal community was look, if we have to close down our law practices and go to the bench and then face an immediate challenge, we may not be applying for these positions. And so the judiciary is a bit different than anything else in that you have a practice of law somehow, whether in the private sector or the public sector. You close that down, you go to the bench by appointment, and then are challenged. So there's some insulating effect by appointment. You get 2 years, and by the time you get 2 years, people kind of forget that you haven't been there longer than 2 years. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is a reality that whether it's the Supreme Court or the district court judge, at least since I've been on the court, since about 2000 or maybe a little bit after I came on in 2005, lawyers in North Dakota have been very busy. And I think their wage and salary and earnings have gone up at a rate considerably higher than what judges are paid. And so we have a number of factors at play. One is you leave the practice, you go to the bench, and it's isolating, that's different type of work. The second is the pay is different. And the third is a lot of people just aren't interested in being judges, I don't think. We were dipping from a small pool. North Dakota has about 1,500 or so practicing lawyers. And from that pool, we select judges. And so there's all kinds of factors, I think, that come into play when you look at who goes to the bench and who challenges. But we've seen some things, again, not on the Supreme Court, because we've only had one challenged election in the recent past. That was Justice Tufte and Mr. Belinsky.
Bob Belinsky, yeah. And that was actually because Belinsky ran again in 2018 against Justice Lisa Becker. Justice Lisa, who has the best name for a judge ever. Her middle name is Fair. Her middle name is Fair. It's like her parents knew. She's going to be a judge. Her middle name's Fair. If I was running her campaigns, that would be my slogan. My middle name's Fair.
You have a way with words. You would be the pitch man. Well, we also don't forget we have a Burleigh County State's attorney. Her last name is Lawyer.
Yeah, that's right.
Literally born for that job.
Yeah, well, she's born for that. She was going to end up there. But you're right. So we've had one contested race. But if you look at the district court races, your question is a good one in terms of why aren't these races competitive or aren't they challenged? In Burleigh County, we had a contested election this year, but in Cass County, we did not. Judge Reed Brady was elected. He was uncontested on both the primary and the general election. The election cycle before in Bismarck, I believe there was only one person on the ballot. So not only are we not seeing challenges, we're not seeing people even go into an empty seat. And with judges races, there's a couple things that go on. First of all, it's really hard for judges to raise money. A lot of the judicial races end up being self-funded. And that's a pretty tough nut to crack. If you're in a district, it's one thing. But if you're running on a statewide basis, like the Supreme Court does, that can get to be an issue. And there's only so many people with an appetite to leave the practice of law or think about leaving the practice of law and then running a statewide election.
So, Justice Crothers, you've really hit on the big question I had for you, and that revolves around the idea of how do we get good people to run for district judgeships specifically is what I'm thinking about. We've talked a lot on this show about how do you get good people to run for the legislature. I mean, the way the system is set up, to be a working person and take 4 months off every 2 years, it's just not a system that works. You've hit on something that I've been thinking a lot about with judges. You have to take a financial hit to be a judge. If you're a practicing attorney who's making good money and whatever, how do we change the system to incentivize to make sure we're getting more folks running for these offices? Because I think the reasons you laid about why people aren't running for these offices are spot on. If I'm a 40-year-old attorney who's making $300,000 a year, judgeship doesn't sound very good to me. So how do we make sure we're getting the best and the brightest into these spots? Not suggesting you're not the best and the brightest, just to be clear, Justice Crothers.
Well, thank you for that. There are those who disagree, but in every case somebody loses.
Yeah.
We struggle with that all the time, and frankly, there's a committee that is working right now. And our purpose is to address judicial compensation. with the next legislature. And I think that's part of it, because what we're seeing most recently is that the lawyers, the amount of money lawyers are making, they make a decent living for the most part. The hardworking, good lawyers make a decent living, and the judgeships pay substantially less. As I don't know. We don't have good statistics on what lawyers make, but they make more than the same judge would make if that same person was a lawyer, typically. And so what we're seeing is a lot of public service lawyers coming into judgeships, either prosecutors or defenders. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we need a balance. And we need a variety of experience on the bench. And I think one of the factors is we don't pay enough, just like the legislature. I don't think they get paid enough so that an average person, so to speak, can leave their job or try get some time off to be a legislator. My father was in the legislature in the 1950s for one term in the House and left it for that very reason. He says, I can't leave a law practice for 4 months and come back and have a law practice. So I heard about that up close and personal then. It hasn't changed in many decades.
Yep.
But I think point one is let's look at what we pay them. Let's look at and then dig into why people aren't becoming judges. But pay is part of it.
One thing, I hang out with a lot of defense attorneys because they're great for a lot of reasons for what I do for a living. And I mean they serve obviously a hugely important role that I think often goes unappreciated maybe by larger society. And anyway, one thing that the point that they make, and I don't know if this is just kind of lawyer gossip or whatever, but they said a lot of times a lawyer who might want to be a judge is afraid to run against a sitting judge because they might lose and then have to practice in front of that judge. Now, I don't want to point fingers at any one judge, and I think people who serve on the bench, I think, are probably there for the same reason people are in the legislature. They want to serve and they want to try to do a good job, but also we're all human beings, and we're all capable of bias and pettiness and everything else. Is there anything to that, you think, where, if I'm in, I don't know, Ward County and I'm going to challenge a sitting judge and then I lose the election and now I have to represent my clients in front of that same judge? I mean, I think we'd like to think there wouldn't be a bias there, but is that a factor where people are afraid of that?
Yeah, I haven't ever put a lot of stock into that. Of course, if somebody challenges a sitting judge, the sitting judge, if they prevail in the election, they cannot sit on that lawyer's cases for a period of time. Typically, it's a year. Sometimes it's longer. But that's just across the board, at least. That's what I have observed. Is most judges I know will say, for a year, I'm not going to sit on that case, and then let's take a look at it. If it was a particularly acrimonious or bitterly fought race, it may be that there is some question about the judge's actual bias against. The rules of professional conduct or the rules of judicial conduct say that a judge cannot be biased for or against a party or their lawyer. And so the judge has an obligation not to sit on that case. And there are other judges, whether it's Ward County or Burleigh County or any other place, there's other judges. And so I don't put a lot of stock into the idea that running against somebody is a career ender. It doesn't happen very often, but I don't think it's a career ender.
So we've talked a little bit here about, getting folks to run. And I think it sort of begs the question, should these races even be on the ballot, right? I mean, are these things that potentially could be appointed? And I think by and large in North Dakota, we've avoided sort of the partisanship around Supreme Court races. That's not the case everywhere, as both of you probably know. I know, like in Pennsylvania, it's millions of dollars spent and both parties are involved in whatever. But obviously there is also partisanship based on appointees and what party's appointing them or whatever. I mean, are you concerned about partisanship and big money sort of sneaking into these races like we're seeing around the country? I can't imagine North Dakota voters would like that very much, but man, as polarized as things are in this country, you never know.
Yeah, that has been a constant concern. It was even a concern before I put my name in the first time in 2005. And that is, North Dakota is a relatively small media market, and what's a little bit of money somewhere else is a lot of money here in an election. And so an interest group could come into North Dakota, pour $2, $3, $4, $500,000 into a race, and it would make a big splash. Where if you were in Ohio, it wouldn't be a noticeable ripple. And so for a big national organization to come in and spend $500,000 or less could be a real problem. And so I applaud North Dakota, both parties, frankly, but North Dakota in general and both of the political parties for staying out of the judicial races. And I think they have stayed out of the races partially because of the people that are on the bench that have some political involvement or had it before they went to the bench. I think they've made it clear to their friends and colleagues who are in the political arena to leave us alone. Let's stay out of the judicial races. I think that would be a really unhealthy move for the state of North Dakota, and certainly for likely for the judges we get. I won't say across the board it'd be unhealthy or a bad situation, but I can't imagine how that would be a good thing. And Chad, you're exactly right. I look at these other states, and I have friends on other courts around the country who are involved. I had a friend on the Ohio Court of Appeals, and his supporters wanted him to run for the Ohio Supreme Court, and I asked him what it would cost, and he said $10 million. How the hell does a judge raise $10 million without selling your soul? I mean, it was just I couldn't believe it.
My last question for this vein, and then I kind of want to get into some specifics of maybe that will be campaign issues, but if you're campaigning, because you mentioned like it's hard to raise money for a judge. Obviously, maybe not in some of these other states, but in North Dakota, like it doesn't attract a lot of money.
In the other states, it's partisan.
Right, right. Well,
that's all it is.
But what always interests me, because I think we elect some offices in like the executive branch that I'm not sure why we're electing, because they can't really make policy. And so when I'm thinking about like a judicial race, what does a judge run on, really? Because you don't write the law, right? Lawmakers write the law. Your job is to apply the law to given, cases or disputes that come before you. So, and there are some things that we're going to talk about. I'm like the state Supreme Court, administers the other court. So there's some policy making there within the judicial branch that I think is relevant and voters can and should care about. But like the larger issue, like if you're running for the legislature, you could say like, I want to lower taxes, or I think we should raise this tax or whatever. What does a judge run on? And if, is having a judge on the ballot encouraging a judge to maybe take a position on policy? And I'm not saying that this is something that's happened, but are you encouraging a judge to take a position on policy that maybe they really shouldn't because it's not their job?
Yeah, there used to be a provision in the Code of Judicial Conduct that prohibited judges from pledging, promising, or committing to a position. The U.S. Supreme Court struck that down as contrary to the First Amendment. And so the model ABA model rule that North Dakota has now adopted, or again adopted, says, well, a judge should not pledge, promise, or commit. And if you do, you must recuse or disqualify from the case going forward on that issue. And so essentially that takes a judge out of any substantive discussion of what the judge might or might not do on a particular issue. And I think properly so. And so you're right. So what kind of judicial campaign do you have? Well, I have a bunch of sharp pencils and I write really well. It's not particularly satisfying for people who want to know what the judge is going to do in a particular case. And that's why you see that circus with the U.S. Supreme Court nominee going before the Senate. Well, one side asks, how will you rule in this case? And they say, I won't answer. And the other asks, how many pencils do you have and are they sharp? And so judicial selection is very difficult because at the end of the day, we want that judge, well, in a perfect world on certain planets, we want a judge to be neutral. But when politics is involved and in the partisan environment we're on in a lot of places, and I think less so in North Dakota, they don't want judges to be neutral. They want judges to be advocates. And that is a problem, both with electing judges and for judges running in the election. And I think in North Dakota, we've been really lucky because we have judges who don't have agendas. We have judges who recognize that the different branches, the three branches, have different functions. And boy, I've been on the court 16 and a half years. I've signed some opinions interpreting legislation, and the results of my writing has been something I didn't care to put my name to. But that's not my job. My job is to put my name to what I understand the law to say. And you come out with the result based on what the law says, even though you find the result not particularly desirable. That's what a judge campaigns on is, so I'm ready to do that. And that attracts as many people as it repels.
So I'm going to ask you to pull back the curtain a little bit on how the Supreme Court functions. I mean, I think it's safe to say that the public is most familiar with the legislative branch. It's very much in the public. I've watched online some Supreme Court hearings. They're generally not that long, right? The justices are asking questions. And then do you guys get together and discuss the cases? Do you individually come up with your opinions? I mean, how does that work?
Well, let me give you a little bit of a quick run through what happens. So we get cases filed. When the parties file briefs, they call them briefs, they're seldom short, but it's the written arguments of the parties. There are 5 of us, and we each receive the briefs. We read the briefs. Just before a case is set for argument, that case, and this is by our tradition, that case is assigned to one of us to write the decision. And so in North Dakota on the Supreme Court, we know who's going to write the decision when we walk into the courtroom. But the court does not formally conference a case. It may be that over the water cooler we might talk to each other by chance about a case, but we don't talk about it beforehand, mostly because we don't have time to. So we go in and we hear the argument. The arguments are usually 50 minutes long. The appellant, the person bringing the appeal, gets 30 minutes. The responding party gets 20. And so you're right, they're relatively short. And after that, the court leaves the courtroom. We go back into our conference room and we talk about the case. And we discuss with the author our preliminary thoughts about how that case should be resolved. The author, the assigned author, then comes up with a decision, writes the decision, and circulates it. And if the author gets a majority, the other people on the case decide whether they want to join or dissent or whatever they might do. And when we get all of the writings done and have a majority opinion and any other separate writings, then we issue the opinion. So that's the quick and dirty about how a case, an adjudicative case, works through the system here.
So let's pivot to your campaign. You're asking voters to give you another 10 years on the court. What's your pitch?
My pitch is I've been here 16 and a half years. I think I have experience to be a judge. The Supreme Court work is still interesting to me. I'm healthy. I'm looking forward to continuing of doing the work. And we have some realities facing us, and that is Justice Vandewaal has been the senior justice on this court since January 1st of 1993. He's 88 years old. He has a term that ends in 2024. I don't know. His intention, he said, is to fill that term. He may or may not be able to do that. But continuity matters. We've had the blessing of him being the continuity for years, and I think if he is able, or even if he's not able to continue through 2024, having a senior justice on this court that's been here a while and has some institutional memory has a value to the state of North Dakota and to the North Dakota Supreme Court in general.
So what's your favorite part of the job? Why do you do it? Why do you, I think you made the case why you're qualified for it, but why do you want to do it again?
The favorite part of it is working on the difficult cases. When you get into an area that is it's unestablished, so you have a problem. Courts are problem solvers. People scratch their heads when we say that, but we make a decision in a case when people can't decide for themselves, and so we have to figure out what happens. My favorite part of it is to find a case that is new ground and then try fashion a reasonable result. Often we're given a set of competing laws where the legislature has done something that when you try to put those pieces together, they don't fit. What do we do? How do we reconcile the problem in a way that we are not making the legislative policy, but we're trying to ascertain what the legislature intended, and if it didn't quite mesh when they were done with it, come to a result that allows them to be more clear later. So it's cases like that where we don't have all of the pieces put together, but on the other hand, anybody that's ever sat on a court, we get up almost every day and remember that somebody's bringing a piece of litigation to us, and that is important to them. And so even though it may be not the hardest legal issue I've ever faced, every morning I get out of bed, I try to remember that I'm doing work on somebody's case because it's important enough to them to bring it to us.
So as you're interpreting laws that the legislature passes, do you ever read it and think, what the hell were these guys trying to do passing this garbage language? And you can choose not to answer that if you want, but you read some of the bills at the end of the session, it's like, my goodness, all you're doing is causing confusion here.
Yeah, sometimes you've both been around the legislative process long enough to know that sometimes the only way to pass a piece of legislation is to make it less than clear. And so they are preserving the argument. And frankly, that goes back to constitutional times. The United States Constitution was drafted with intentional vagary because it would not have been adopted had there been more specific terms. And so this is not new. And that's the job of the courts, is say, okay, what did they mean? Is it clear? Apply it. If it's ambiguous, what was the intent? If the intent can't be figured out, come up with something reasonable and give them another chance. And I think we have a great relationship with the North Dakota legislature going both ways. I think we are fairly honest with our work with their legislation, and every legislative session, there are 6 or 8 or 10 bills that effectively reverse a ruling of this court. And I'm fine. That's their role. If they don't agree with what we said, they should change it. That's their role. But our role is to figure out what we think they said.
Yep.
One part of your job on the state Supreme Court is to sort of administer the court system as well. We saw not so long ago the court tried to implement an online record system so that people could go and download the records online. And I went on and looked myself. I imagine as many North Dakotans maybe did. I went on and looked myself up immediately and found my social security number just hanging out in the open on the internet, which was not, and my home address and everything, which was, it's some of that information. I don't know. Some of it, maybe it's just public record and that's fine, but certainly my social security number's not. But anyway, the court ended up, I guess, putting that toothpaste back in the tube. And where are we sitting with that right now? And is that going to get implemented at some point?
Yeah, we are still working on that. That was about 2 years ago that we rolled that out. I think it was the January of 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And it was live for a couple of weeks, and we found out a little bit to our surprise that there was a whole lot of personally identifying information in our court records that should not have been there. Now, we did some sampling, and we knew that there was some, and we made an informed judgment that we thought it was manageable. It turned out that your experience sounds about right, because I think a lot of people did that, and we heard howls that personally identifying information was in more court records than we were aware. And so we pulled it down, and the first step we made was to contact vendors that are out there, and we received bids on what it would cost to have them go through, scan our records, and redact them on an automated process, and it was cost prohibitive. And so that was strike one. We then sent the rule back to the committee that had studied it and made recommendations to us previously, and we also talked to the people who were filing. And a lot of I'm going to speak broadly here, and maybe more broadly than I should, but a lot of the personally identifying information that was ending up in the court records was coming from government agencies. Through driver's licenses, old driver's license, new driver's license number, that sort of thing. A lot of it was coming through traffic tickets, that sort of thing, and it shouldn't have been there, and it was. And so we worked on reducing or eliminating the amount of incoming information. We then went back to the committee and said, okay, let's look at this rule and see if we can tighten it a little bit so that we don't have all of the documents that we're finding the personally identifying information in. Is there a certain type of document we can remove that will dramatically reduce the bad information getting out, or the good information getting out, however you look at it. And they worked on that, and they came back to the court with a proposal, I think last summer. And the court said, too tight. This keeps too much information. And so we sent it back to the committee, and we are waiting for the committee to get back with us. And so we have a court committee of technologists and lawyers and other people who are working on this, and I think fairly diligently working on it. It's called our court, we call it the Court Services Committee. I think there's another word in there, like Court Administration Services or something. But they're working on it. And so that's where it's at. We haven't given up on it. We hope to make a reasonable amount of court information available as we think it should be. But we also have to protect the private information of individuals, including myself.
Have you thought about like just maybe picking a date and saying after this date they're all going to be online, but the previous stuff you got to do it the old way? And to the court credit, when I had a previous job as a private investigator, did background checks. Now working the job I do today, I do a lot of records, and they're great about getting back to me. I mean, a lot of time I can email a clerk, and I'm within a couple hours, I'll have the records sitting in my inbox. The people who work in the courthouses are great. They do a great job. But, the online records, that would be great too. I feel like it would probably cut down maybe on some costs at the courthouse of people trying to get records. Can you do it that way where we just say, hey, going forward, we're doing it the new way, but if it's old records, you got to do it the old way?
Yeah, well, guess what? That's what we thought we did last time. We had a cutoff date, and we should not have had as much personal information in the records as we did. And so, yeah, we thought we did that, and yes, we're doing that again. Plus, but the goal is exactly as you say. These are public records, or most of these. They are public record. You can walk into a courthouse now and ask the clerk to hand you a file, or if it's electronic, there's a public terminal in almost every courthouse in North Dakota. And you can go on there unrestricted and look up a file. You don't have to have a reason. You don't have to have anything other than a way to get to the courthouse to do it. And so you can do that right now. And our philosophy, or the philosophy of most of us here on the court, is you should be able to do that without having to get in a car to go to the courthouse to do it.
Yeah.
So we're working on it. And you're right. There were some failures upstream, but we're trying to get this done and get it back online, but it is not. I can't give you a date.
So it's my understanding that earlier this morning you were a judge at We the People at the state capitol. And so my question for you is, why is that an interest of you to participate in that kind of thing? And secondly, are we confident that the children are going to save us after you spent time watching them this morning?
Boy, if you'd asked me yesterday, I after watching the news on Monday, Tuesday, I'd say, I'm not so sure. But when I come back from We the People, I am quite sure they will save us. We the People program, for those not familiar, is constitutionally based. It has a instructional book. It's taught or used in many public schools to teach government. It goes from Unit 1 to Unit 6. Unit 1 is the theoretical underpinnings of that which the framers thought about when they created the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And it goes through federalism and how we came up with our, again, constitutional underpinnings. And it then works through the various pieces of constitutional three-branch government and what each branch does and is supposed to do. And it's phenomenal to see these kids come in here. And what we do is set up that they all 6 units have participants, and they give a 4-minute statement, and then they answer 6 minutes of questions from judges. And it's amazing to see these 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds answer questions and indicate that they do know something about our constitutional republic. And today, after every presentation, I asked the kids, I said, how many of you are 18 or will be by the primary election? And everyone I was judging Unit 6, and everyone on the units that I judged was going to be a new voter. So we're creating, at least from this segment, a group of voters who have some basic understanding of how we got here. Going back to the broader question, why do I do it? I think a person who just sits on the bench and doesn't think outside of the case flow is well, I won't say about anybody else. I would not be a happy person if that's all I did. And so I do a lot of teaching. Since I have been a justice on the Supreme Court, I have taught just under 200 seminars to judges, lawyers, and students all over the country and overseas to some extent. And so outreach for me is a big part of what we do, and it's something I've actively been involved in. And if you want, I can talk about some court programs where we've actually tried to increase the outreach effort.
Well, we're actually running a little over time. We used up all the time you allotted for us, so I really appreciate you coming on. I don't know why Chad was getting down. As someone who interacts with the general public, with the adult public on a daily basis, I got to tell you, the kids probably have civics down better than some of these grown-ups that I deal with. I don't know.
Absolutely. I look at your Facebook feed, Rob.
Yeah,
I know the adults you deal with are not.
I look at it too, unfortunately. I should just delete my Facebook. Anyway, Justice Crothers, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Gentlemen, it's been a blast talking to you. Thank you.
Well, I just finish up my first interview in a judicial race ever, Chad, although I don't know if you could call it a judicial race if he ends up running unopposed. It's not really a race.
Here's the thing. I thought that was super interesting.
I
don't know if it was that exciting for listeners, but Of
course it was exciting. If it was on this show, it was exciting, Chad.
Right. And by the way, when you do your introduction at the beginning, first of all, it's getting longer where you talk about, subscribing and all that other stuff.
Well, it's very important.
I think when you start talking about the increase in listenership, you need to start calling it the O-Ban bump.
The O-Ban bump. Do you think that's it? It predated O-Ban though, but.
Well, I mean, don't let your facts get in the way of my argument.
All right, fair enough. Hey, I tell you one thing that would spice up the judiciary. I watch a lot of British television. I think we ought to impose a dress code like the Brits do it, right? Like not just the judge in the robe, but the lawyers got to wear the robe too. We should call them barristers. I think that's more fun than lawyer. And I think everybody ought to wear wigs.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think you should actually change course of your career and just push to make that change.
I think we ought to put an initiated measure to make the lawyers, right? It's boring as spit. They're usually up to a lot of no good in the court anyway. They may as well look silly while they're doing it.
Now you trust the voters to do initiated measures, Port?
Yeah, all right, fair enough. Fair enough. Only for trivial things that don't really matter.
Perfect.
Like making lawyers wear wigs. Wouldn't that be great, though? Like if they just drive by the courthouse and they're all standing outside.
It certainly would make it more interesting.
Wearing a bunch of silly wigs. But they not just like the colonial white wigs. Like you should get to choose. You could have like a rainbow-colored afro or something. All sorts of stuff.
You're all in on this idea. I mean, you've got some details worked out.
I've been thinking about this a little bit.
I'll give you some names of 25 sponsors to put on your initiated measure committee.
You're not going to sponsor my initiated measure?
I want to see the language first.
The devil's in the details. All right, let's talk about Representative Rick Becker.
What? We never talk about that.
Yeah,
guy.
well, we have a couple of columns this week. Jim Shaw had a column where he called, and for understandable reason, I wanted to. So first of all, completely sympathetic to the motivations of that column. But in that column called for disciplinary action. Now, I don't think Shaw himself, maybe I have to go back and reread the column, but I'm pretty sure he just called for some sort of a disciplinary action against Representative Rick Becker. Now, Representative Rick Becker, of course, is a Republican lawmaker from Bismarck. During his day job is a plastic surgeon, so he's got a medical license. And he's kind of he's a member of the Bastiat caucus. He was, I don't want to call it the far, like he's a member of the Republican caucus, and he very much his faction of the party is the anti-vax, conspiracy theory, the election was stolen. That's his crowd. And he has been, if you watch his social media feeds and his television show and all this stuff, he leans on his medical degree to say things about masking and about vaccines and about treating COVID-19 that, and you don't take my word, I'm just a Yahoo with a column and a podcast. Other doctors are saying this stuff is nonsense. This and worse, coming from somebody with a medical degree who people may trust, they're saying, he either needs to stop or maybe he needs to lose his medical license. Now, again, I am completely sympathetic to that because I'm as tired as everybody else of everybody getting on Facebook and just pandering to the crowd. And I think that's absolutely what Representative Becker's doing. I don't think he really cares about the well-being of the average member of his audience who's listening to that stuff, right? He would probably say otherwise. I don't think he cares. I think what he cares about is that people are listening and people are paying attention to him and people are liking his Facebook posts and sharing his memes and trying to get him to tune into his television show, which I got to tell you, I've seen his ratings. They're not that great. Not a lot of people are, but that's what he wants. He wants attention, right? We have a proud history of grandstanding politicians who trade in that currency. And I think that's absolutely what Representative Becker's doing. Now, this is, I think, where Chad and I disagree. I think we need to be very, very careful about acting against his medical degree through a regulatory process. Because what I'm afraid of is that, with Becker specifically, you're going to turn the man into a martyr. He's just going to become more popular than ever because he could say, look, the establishment's out to get him. They can't handle my truth. That's already his shtick. And you're just going to fuel that fire. That's part of what concerns me. The other part is, what sort of a precedent are we setting for other situations where maybe the person who's saying controversial things isn't necessarily wrong? Right? And I'm not saying that about Becker. I think Becker's wrong. But I worry about the precedent that we're setting where we're going to start inserting politics into that regulatory process. I think that's a very dangerous precedent to set. So my advice is, we need other doctors to rebut him. And I realize that's not satisfying for anybody and that's difficult, but I still believe that the solution for problematic speech is more speech. And I know that's quaint in the social media age, but I still believe in it. Chad, I know you disagree.
Well, I don't know that I necessarily disagree. The first thing I would say is the three doctors that were quoted in the Shaw column, Dr. Grant Severson, Dr. Kathy Anderson, Dr. Joan Connell. They've been on the front lines of, messaging what we need to do to get through this pandemic for several years now. In full disclosure, Dr. Kathy Anderson is my son's pediatrician. And I will tell a quick story about Dr. Anderson that sort of shows she's not some radical lefty when it comes to treating this thing. Before the Pfizer vaccine was approved for children 5 to 11, we reached out to her and said, hey, when this is approved, should we give our son the shot? Her response was, I haven't seen the research. I can't give you that advice until I see the research. Then we had a half-hour conversation where she went through the research with us and, answered our questions and whatever. So this isn't just a doctor who's saying, everybody get the shot. There should be no questions about what the CDC is doing or whatever. She's fantastic and wanted to look at the research beforehand. But I would just say that these three doctors are probably exhausted from this misinformation and having to deal with somebody who, like Rick Becker, who has a bigger megaphone than them. Even if the Beck ratings are low, a lot of people are listening to him. And it's no different than Rand Paul. He does
have an audience. I want to he does absolutely have an audience.
But it's no different than Rand Paul at the national level, right? I think he's said that Dr. Fauci's killed millions of people or something like that. And when these medical providers are politicians who use their medical license to sort of say, look, I'm an expert on this or whatever, don't believe what everybody else is saying. I think we do risk these folks sort of doing what's popular with their constituents rather than what their medical background would maybe inform them to do. And so is Rand Paul, is Rick Becker, are these guys saying this stuff about ivermectin and whatever because it's the right thing to do in the medical community? Or is it to get clicks? Is it to get attention? Is it to get reelection? Is it to get a following? If it's the latter, then maybe we need to look at, if he's qualified to be a medical provider. And just to be clear, I don't know. I don't even understand the process or the research that goes in. But I mean, maybe take a look at things. If somebody was out there, saying smoke cigarettes, it'll make you run marathons better. I think we'd look at their medical license. I think that the advice that's being given by folks who, it could be killing people. And I think we need to take it seriously. Again, I'm with you. I don't think we knee-jerk yank somebody's medical license. But I don't think it's a bad conversation to have.
Yeah. And again, because I'm sympathetic to the motivations, but there's first of all, don't get your medical advice from anybody who's dispensing it in a public forum, and especially a politician. You should get your medical advice from a doctor that you trust, right? Whether it's your primary care physician or some specialist you've been referred to or somebody you've chosen saying this is going to be my doctor now. Go to them, have them evaluate you specifically and your specific medical history, and then have them give advice to you privately. That's not in a public setting where that advice might be geared not so much for your well-being, but to titillate an audience. That really concerns me. Just the number, and we have a long history of this stuff, from the snake oil salesman, back in previous centuries to, modern people who are on, daytime talk shows selling diet quackery, right? Like, you got to be careful about who's giving you medical advice. The best place to get that is from a licensed professional who has examined you. Also, Representative Becker is a plastic surgeon, right? I don't go to my podiatrist when I need a new eye prescription. Right. So there's some problems with that specifically. But again, what really, and I go back to the lab leak thing, right? And I mentioned this in my column about it. We made a mistake. Like the public health apparatus, and I don't want to single out any one person, but the public health apparatus has not done itself any favors, and they've made some very, very serious mistakes. One is closing ranks, that the lab leak thing can't even talk about it. Facebook censoring it, Twitter censoring it, and then everybody had to roll it back. And what does that tell the public is, sometimes they're wrong. We got to be very careful when we're coming out and saying you're not allowed to speak this way or you're not allowed to talk about this, because sometimes you do more harm than good, and I'm worried about that in this situation.
And I think any sort of licensure, be it medical, be it attorney, be it teacher, we need to be careful about pulling things willy-nilly. And I'll just add on to you talked about the lab thing, but I also just think the way the CDC has been given guidance over the last couple months in particular. I had a colleague call me the other day, and they had a family member who had a positive case, and they're like, do you know what the current guidance of CDC is? I'm reading it right now, and it makes no sense. That doesn't help either.
No. Honestly, I don't think Dr. Fauci helps at this point. Now, I realize, certain Republican and conservative people, like they've made him the target, and I think the harassment and stuff that he's faced in that context is terrible, and I'm not okay with any of it. On the other hand, kind of turning him into this messianic figure of the pandemic, and he's doing all these interviews, and he's just omnipresent all the time, and everybody's like hanging on his word like he's the Pope. I don't think that helped either. When I watched him and Rand Paul recently square off, I was like, will you both just shut up? Because the rest of us are trying to get through this.
I sort of had the same feeling and saw that. Part of me is like, thanks for calling it out, right? That there's politics behind where Rand Paul was, but I'm also just sick of it as well. But I think the public needs to understand that things are going to change through a pandemic. Even like the conversation about a cloth mask isn't as effective now with the Omicron, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that was bad advice 18 months ago, right? It doesn't just take away that from 18 months ago. These things change. And again, I think looking at the Dr. Oz's, the Rand Pauls, the Rick Beckers, you go down the list, when they're trying to serve a goal of getting a bigger audience or getting more votes or whatever, they just need to be really careful with how they're using that medical license. To your point, though, I mean, there also has to have people have to have some level of sort of personal responsibility here. If you're listening to somebody on Beck TV to get your medical advice, that's probably not the best way to do things, or even a U.S. senator.
Yeah, I like so many of these things. I think the tendency is you want to start at the top and say this person's the problem, and because that's easier, and in many ways it's not as dangerous as saying, and dangerous like maybe to your career or your elected office or whatever, as saying the problem's starting at the bottom, right? Like who's enabling people like Dr. Oz to it's all the people buying into his latest quackery that he sells, essential oils or whatever. I don't know. I've never watched Dr. Oz in my life, so I couldn't tell you. But you know what I mean? It's a lot of times the problem is us. Like American citizens in large numbers are making the decision that I'm going to get my medical advice from Facebook, right? That's the core problem. If these people were going to their doctors and listening to their doctor's advice and not arguing with their doctors because, hey, I saw this on Facebook, that's the problem. And it's been around even before the pandemic. There was when we were having one of our children, there was like a pregnancy group that we went to for a while. And I had to get up and walk out of one of their meetings because in one of them, it was all about like, well, your doctor's going to tell you this, and you need to tell them this, this, and this. And I'm thinking, okay, the doctor has a medical degree. You're a flipping yoga instructor. Right? Like you're telling these women to go in and question their doctor. And again, I don't have a problem with anybody getting a second opinion or using their common sense. You know, doctors are not infallible, right? I'm not saying that. But I mean, there is sort of that attitude of we're going to tell the doctors how we want it done that pre-existed the pandemic. And to me, if anything's the problem, that's the problem.
Well, but if you're Dr. Severson, if you're Dr. Anderson, if you're Dr. Knoll, I also understand the frustration of being ignored by policymakers, by being ignored by, school officials, being ignored by the public because you got Dr. Becker and his ilk sort of out screaming you on social media. So, I mean, I think that it is a little naive to say, well, we should just use, the First Amendment to counter this thing. How does Dr. Anderson get a megaphone as large as Dr. Becker at this point? And at the end of the day, these three are just trying to keep their patients safe. Yeah. And they see this person who's making it more difficult to keep people safe in our state. I understand their frustration. I don't have any problem for them calling him out and saying maybe this guy shouldn't be a licensed medical provider anymore. I'm at wit's end, right? You're at wit's end. I couldn't imagine if I'm seeing patients every single day, they've got to be at wit's end. They've got to be exhausted. They watched the way that our elected officials during the special session handled all of this stuff. I mean, a lot of them were there. I mean, it's got to be frustrating.
Maybe as a sort of corollary for this, we had a little kerfuffle this week about the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a story reported by NPR originally. They originated the story, and it suggested that Trump appointee Justice Neil Gorsuch had refused to wear a mask despite being asked to do so by Chief Justice John Roberts, who was trying to accommodate Justice Sonia Sotomayor, an Obama appointee, because she has diabetes and she has some health concerns about COVID. So it was kind of like, oh, this conservative judge won't wear a mask and he's being a jerk, even though this liberal judge asked him nicely to. Now, I took the original story at face value and I posted it, and I was critical of Justice Gorsuch, and I said, gosh, why wouldn't you just put on a mask? It's just a mask, right? Why wouldn't you put that on? I mean, I'll tell you, I don't spend a lot of time wearing masks these days. I just don't. I'm not sure. I kind of feel like that ship has sailed, but whatever. If somebody asks me to put on a mask, I put on a mask. I don't have a problem with it. It costs me nothing. If they feel better about it, or if that's the policy of their store or whatever, I'm going to wear it. I don't see what the big deal is. Now, later on, it turned out both Justice Gorsuch and Sotomayor have now issued a press release saying the original report was bunk. So I feel like NPR owes us an explanation of how they ended up reporting that. But that's all beside the point. When I wrote about this on Facebook, immediately it was like, he shouldn't have to wear a mask. They don't work. Why would you do this? And I'm just trying to ask, talking about being at your wit's end. I'm just trying to tell people, why wouldn't you just do it? Like, if it's somebody you work with, somebody you know, right? And obviously Gorsuch and Sotomayor are going to have a long working relationship together on the U.S. Supreme Court. Why? And obviously the story was bunk. So, there was Sotomayor and Gorsuch are getting along just fine. The story was bunk. But supposing it was true, why wouldn't you just put a mask on? Like, we've lost that. It's like, if I put a mask on, I'm giving in to the liberals, and I don't want to do that.
So, first of all, I fell for it last night too. Aaron and I, my wife and I, were having conversations about what a jerk Gorsuch was. Just put on the mask. I mean, what's happened to our country that we can't even do such a thing, and the fact that it came out to be bunk, and the fact that they put out a statement together, I think, is sort of cool.
Very cool.
That it wasn't just him denying it, but yeah, and I'm still wearing a mask everywhere I go in public. And I don't judge other people for not wearing a mask.
Which is just about everybody, judging anecdotally what I'm seeing around mine. I don't see very many masks anymore.
Yeah, and there was a time where I was like, oh, what a bunch of jerks not wearing a mask. But now I think people are tired, and I understand being tired. And if I wear a mask because it makes me feel better, it's not that big of a deal. If I have meetings with people, often folks will say, do you want me to put on a mask? And most of the time I say no, but if I do, they put them on. I mean, this is just like being a good neighbor. I mean, if it makes me feel a little bit better that you're wearing a mask when we're 4 feet away from each other, just put on the damn mask.
I don't know why. I mean, even like a complete stranger, if somebody like tapped me on the shoulder and they're like, hey, would you put on a mask? Why would I pick a fight with this person when the alternative is I just put on a mask and say, sure, I don't have a problem with that.
Or the people like picking fights at airports saying, I don't want you knew before you got to the airport you had to wear a mask. Just put on the mask. We don't need to have these fights all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think that gets back to my theory about the entire country going through the C-SPAN effect, right? Like they said, when they put cameras in Congress and all the Congress people started grandstanding around the cameras and the speeches got longer and more elaborate and they're bringing in props and all this stuff because they're playing to the cameras. Social media is our camera now. And so how much of the stuff we're seeing on social media is somebody recording themselves behaving this way, like shouting at people in the grocery store, and like little kids are walking by in the produce aisle, like looking at these grown-ups shouting at each other, like, what is going on? They're recording themselves, right? Yeah. It's not like David Attenborough popped his head up over the peaches and was recording this surreptitiously, and they don't know. They're recording themselves doing this. They're behaving this way on purpose.
And it really is simple. It sort of goes back to kindergarten, right? Treat those around you nicely. Treat others the way you want to be treated. I mean, again, speaking of sounding a little naive, but so much of it is just complete silliness. And, when adults are fighting, it's kids that are losing every single time.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunate, but with Representative, it's a sticky wicket, for sure. Because on one hand, you don't want people out there saying things that are demonstrably false, and especially somebody who has a medical degree. Like, better. And I would agree. There's a higher level of responsibility on you when you have your medical degree and you tout your medical degree and you're trotting it out. If you're going to say something in that context, there's a higher level of scrutiny than if, the rando who's trying to sell essential oils and making some ridiculous claims on Facebook. Like, that's a different order of magnitude. But it's just, we got to be careful because we can't ignore the trust environment that we're living in right now. One of the reasons I was so upset about the NPR article is not just that they took me in, and so I ended up having to do like a social media retraction and felt like an idiot because I don't like promulgating false information. But the other part of it is the hit that the journalism industry takes, right? Right. Because all the like the trust nobody crowd can just turn around and say, see, here's another example. And on this one, they got a point.
Yeah, and I think going back to Representative Becker, Dr. Becker again, I don't know enough about generally what it takes for the medical licensing board to discipline a doctor. Is this a normal thing that they would discipline somebody for or not? I just don't know that. I suppose the 3 doctors that talked to Jim Shaw would know better than I would. But I think if there's precedent for looking at somebody's license or disciplining in some way for this kind of behavior, they should look at it. But I also agree it will make him a martyr if they would do anything even more so than he is now.
Well, I don't think it would help at all. Well, we gotta wrap up the show there. So says my dog, who's barking in the background. Coming up on Friday, U.S. Senator Kevin Cramer is actually going to be on the podcast. We have a regular standing interview. He's going to be on just fresh off visiting Ukraine. So that's going to be interesting because as we're all obsessing about masks and everything at home, there's a lot of stuff happening in the world that Americans need to be paying attention to. And unfortunately, our role in the world, we're still a leader, but we're not the leader we used to be. We're going to talk with him a little bit about that on Friday. And next week, I think this is tentative, but we have some polling numbers on like teacher retention and stuff coming out. That I think is going to be pretty interesting on next Wednesday's show.
Right on. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I think what's going on in our schools right now, and you said your wife is student teaching, it's a tough time to be working in our schools. It's very high stress, understaffed, and I think it's something that we need to spend more time thinking about.
Well, as always, thanks for tuning in to Plain Talk, and we'll talk again.